everyone, and welcome to episode 12 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. This month, the medieval community got an unexpected and very pleasant surprise in the form of an inconspicuous vellum fragment that had been used to bind together the pages of a garden-variety Tudor-era printed manual on administration. When the 16th-century English binder put together this ordinary book, he, or she, had no idea that a few centuries later, that little piece of vellum would make big waves for historians. Written in Gaelic on the vellum fragment were some of the opening sections of the Canon of Medicine, one of the medieval world's most famous texts, written by the Islamic doctor Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, as he was known to Westerners. Avicenna's Canon was one of the pillars of medical study in Europe for hundreds of years, and it covers everything from surgery to hangover cures, making it an essential text for practicing doctors and a window into medieval medical practice. The thing is, although Irish doctors were known to have studied elsewhere in Europe, no Irish copies of the Canon were known to have survived. Until now. This week, I spoke to Dr. Padraig O'Machain of University College Cork, who was instrumental in bringing the Avicenna fragment from obscurity to its rightful place in Irish medical history. Padraig is head of the Department of Modern Irish and the School for Irish Learning, and he has devoted his scholarly career to Irish paleography and codicology. He's also directed the Irish Script on Screen project, the new digital home of the Avicenna fragment. Here's our conversation on why the Avicenna fragment is such an important discovery, and why it's a prime example of the unique nature of Irish medical practice in the Middle Ages. Hi, Padraig, and thanks for joining us today to talk about your new discovery.
Thanks, Danièle.
Happy to have you. So, tell us what happened. You found an interesting bookbinding.
Yeah, well, I suppose it was a series of events rather than a major moment of discovery, in that this book has been in the possession of a family in Cornwall for centuries, really, because it belonged to the signature of an ancestor of the current members of the family is on this book. It was a printed book in Latin, printed in London in 1534 or 1536. There are two dates on the title page, and around it, used to bind it, is a double leaf taken from an Irish manuscript from the 15th century, a double vellum leaf. And I suppose the owner was always intending maybe to discover what this might be. I don't think she actually knew that it was a Gaelic script or insular minuscule at all. So last summer she took a photograph with her phone and sent it to an academic that she knew and who in Britain, who forwarded it to Ireland, and it was sent to me then, because this is my area, if you like, of expertise. And it was then I had the eureka moment, if you wish, that I recognized straight away that it was a medical text. You must imagine, I'm sure you've seen some of the images of the binding as it was on the book. The double leaf had been trimmed and folded twice and then stitched together. So it was the text wasn't, if you like, legible in any continuous way, but it was clear when I looked at it that it was a medical text, and we were looking at a manuscript from at least the early 15th century, if not the late 14th. So I've had the good fortune for many years to be collaborating for over 30 years, would you believe, with the only living expert on the Irish medical manuscripts from the medieval period, namely Dr. Aoibhinn Ní Chonaicheamh from the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. So I got in touch with her straight away, and she identified the text as the opening section of Avicenna's Canon of Medicine. Now, this was a text that was widely distributed throughout the Middle Ages and highly regarded right up to the 17th century, in fact. But we had, even though we have quite an amount of medical writings in Irish from that period, from the late medieval period, one text we've been missing is Avicenna's Canon. So this was a major, if you like, discovery to find that in fact it had been translated into Gaelic, and here we had the one, in this binding of this book, we had the solid evidence for that.
Yeah, I was wondering how it came to you, and it turns out that the people were reaching out for scholarly advice on this, and they actually let you take the binding of the book apart, didn't they?
Yeah. So when all this happened, I got in touch with the owners, and who happened to be extremely enlightened, if you like, in this regard. I explained its importance, and I made an offer then. I said, if you would trust me with your book, and if you would agree to have it disbound by probably one of the greatest conservators and the most expert conservators in the world, namely John Gillis, who has worked on many on Kells and medieval Irish books, like the Book of Kells and the Book of Durrow, Book of Armagh. He will expertly remove it, if you will consent to the binding being removed and flattened, opened out and flattened and cleaned up and conserved. He will also put a new binding on your book of contemporary, of modern parchment, and we'll digitize the both sides of the double leaf and return it to you. If you'd agree to that, it would be great. It would be wonderful for scholarship, and we'd be extremely grateful to you. So they did agree, and fairly rapidly too. So it involved me going to Cornwall, flying over to Cornwall, collecting the book, bringing it back, having the work done, and bringing it back within a period, I think, of a week or two. You can imagine how appreciative I am of, if you like, of the understanding of the owners, because it isn't everyone. In fact, it would probably be very rare when someone would actually entrust you with something of this nature. But I think we were all joined in the spirit of inquiry and on the principle of the advancement of scholarship, which the owners understood as well. So it was really a collaborative and cooperative effort on all sides at this time.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary that they would let you take the book in and take the binding off, because that book itself is hundreds of years old.
Yes,
they might very well have kept it.
Well, I suppose it helps in the fact that I may have some reputation in this regard, and having spent my life since 1985, gainfully employed, working with manuscripts and old books right up to the present day. Maybe that perhaps reassured them to some extent that I was trustworthy and serious in this enterprise.
Yes, I'm sure it did. So you told the owners before you took the book and took the binding off how important this was to find Avicenna. Yeah,
absolutely, and how helpful it would be to us working in this area to have access to the whole text and to have high resolution digital images of the entire artifact. And again, they understood that completely, and I suppose had you not that level of understanding and appreciation, this wouldn't really have happened.
So it is a big discovery to have Avicenna in Ireland, because we know that Irish doctors, scholars went over and learned about medicine in Europe and would have come across Avicenna. But this is the first time Avicenna has been found in Irish. Is that true?
That's absolutely correct, yeah. And moreover, I suppose it underlines, and I suppose the publicity that has attended this discovery underlines the fact that of all the disciplines, the scholarly disciplines, the learned disciplines practiced in Ireland in the late medieval period, that of medicine was the most outward looking, if you understand. In other words, medicine and the practice of medicine and the scholarship of medicine put scholars in Ireland in touch, if you like, in contact with contemporary medieval, contemporary European practice. And it's clear that the curriculum that was being followed in the European schools was being followed in the Irish schools of medicine as well. So this was very important to us. And I've been working in manuscripts all my life, and I've made, if you like, other discoveries along the way, but for some reason this seems to have captured the public imagination. Perhaps, obviously, I suppose the connection with Islamic medicine and the learning practiced in a country on the periphery of Europe in the late Middle Ages was maybe the setting point, if you wish. But it has been very beneficial to us, if I may say so, in that it has explained to a wide and general audience and let them see that whereas Ireland has been imagined, in popular imagination, has been thought of as being a sort of an underdeveloped country intellectually in the late Middle Ages, that is not in fact the truth. Much emphasis is placed in the early Christian period and the missionaries and the intellectual contribution of the Irish to European culture at that time, but no knowledge or emphasis has been, if you like, disseminated concerning scholarly activity in post Norman era 1200 down to 1600, and that has been one of the side effects of this, if you like, in that the public has engaged with that and suddenly discovered. So you had schools in Ireland, schools of learning in Ireland at this period. I said, yes, of course we had, yes.
Yeah, I can't say I'm surprised that there were schools in Ireland. I never have thought of it as backward. But what I didn't realize was, in reading your other articles about this discovery, is that many of these medical books, including this one, are written in the vernacular. So they're written in Irish. So that's kind of different from most of the other copies of Avicenna, for example, which are in Latin. So I think it's really interesting that people were writing in the vernacular, meaning other people could read it, not just the scholars.
Yeah, and I think we're pretty much exceptional in that regard in the late Middle Ages, in that everywhere Latin was the language of learning. But in Ireland, the vernacular was the language of learning. And I suppose, in a sense, that is a continuation from the High Middle Ages, from what evidence we have, in that schools existed outside of the monastic schools, where learning was practiced in the vernacular. And that was an inheritance, if you like, that was taken up and continued in the late medieval period. Shows you, I suppose, in a sense, in a very wider sense, the self-confidence of the Irish in using their own language as a language of learning, and easily, with great facility, accommodating and translating texts from Latin into Irish without any difficulty at all, and using neologisms, loanwords, and so forth, and for technical terms. And we have small hints at how this was done. You know, one scholar would translate the text orally, if you understand, from reading, and another scholar would write that down, and that was it. It wasn't a huge, if you like, funded project that we might imagine in contemporary times, and yet it has left us. You know, we have said 25% of manuscripts surviving from the late medieval period are medical. You know, so it's a significant number.
Yeah, I saw that in one of the other articles as well, that 25% of the books were medical books, and they just had this kind of illustrates the practical purpose of books for the Irish at this time. So what did you mean by that?
Well, I suppose the first point to be made is that learning in late medieval Ireland, as elsewhere, was very much an elite activity, okay? It was dependent on patronage from the lordships that were, if you like, distributed all around Ireland, some stronger than others, and therefore some in better position to sponsor learning. And when I talk about learning, I'm talking about 4 branches of learning: poetry, history, law, and medicine. So the practice of medicine, if you like, reflected at this very high level, reflected that elitist background. And so the medical schools tended to be sponsored and under the patronage of, let's say, a local lord, who, in return for his sponsorship, which consisted really of land and accommodation rent free, in return for his sponsorship, would have the benefit, if you like, of doctors and scholars on his doorstep. But it wasn't just confined to that, because there's a great tradition in Ireland of, in the fine weather, in the spring and the summer, of scholars going on tour, if you like, and going around, you know, traveling around the country and getting reward for their services. And I'm speaking of the 4 branches here just as much as the single branch of medicine. And we have evidence for that as well, of doctors and medical scholars attending to itemizing their itinerary, if you like, of nobles, castles and residences where they attended to the ill and the infirm of the nobility. That's how these books came to be written. That's how the manuscripts came to be written, and how learning prospered. So further down the food chain, if you wish, we don't really have any evidence of this type of medicine, of European medicine, being practiced, say, amongst by the doctors on the lower orders. Although one can imagine that, you know, I don't know, that maybe they would have done that, but it's not in evidence. And that, I suppose, is where folk medicine kicks in then.
Talking about Avicenna being in the vernacular and these scholars going around and actually sort of treating people on a tour of the country, do you imagine that this type of book being in vernacular would be something that they take with them, or that they would leave behind and have already taken in the information?
Well, we have many examples, or a number of examples of pocket-sized manuscripts, which clearly were meant for being carried around. We have very few large format, let's say folio-sized medical books. So I can well imagine that the medical compendia, and many of them are compendia, the texts are formed from a number of sources were meant to be carried around. We also have evidence, which is how we have in a number of cases these itineraries surviving of manuscripts being written in situ, as it were, as the doctors go from place to place. They find in their spare time they're still writing their books. So yes, we have very small books as well, clearly intended as pocketbooks and manuals for the doctors as they journeyed around.
That's really interesting. So coming back to this fragment being part of a binding later, have you found a lot of Irish vellum being used as bindings in England, or is this kind of unusual?
This is unusual. This is a unique example, in fact. Now, the use of earlier material to bind books is I was going to say worldwide at the time, a European phenomenon at least, and in the Middle East as well. You find where even in Ireland we have traces of in later bindings, say bindings that were created in the 18th century. They would incorporate the older slipcases, if you like, the loose vellum leaves on the outside of a manuscript. And in some cases, one or two cases at least, those are clearly from a different tradition, from Latin antiphons and antiphonries and so forth. In Europe, it's quite commonplace for a Gaelic manuscript to be used as a binding for something else. This is a unique example.
That's interesting, because I know that a lot of Irish treasures were brought over, especially during the Elizabethan period. This is right before Elizabeth, but I was just wondering if it was unusual for Irish books to be part of these bindings.
Yeah, it is. And I say this is a sole example. It's a great example. It's a magnificent example. You can see traces of early bindings used as binder's waste, of course. It was used as backing or inside the front covers as padding. But again, that's very, very rare from the Gaelic side, but it's quite common from the Latin tradition and so forth. No, this is a unique example, and it's absolutely fantastic.
So when you found it, you immediately wanted to share it with the world through Irish Script on Screen, which is a digitization project that you've been involved in since the beginning. So can you tell us a little bit about Irish Script on Screen?
I can, of course, yeah.
That'd be great.
It's actually 20 years old this year. That is 20 years old since it went live. But we started it when I worked at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Dublin for many years, and we started this digitization project really got going in 1997, planning for it. We were inspired, if you like, by the Celtic Manuscripts project, which was then taking place in the Bodleian in Oxford. And in fact, we consulted and eventually used some of the staff from that project on our own project. The Oxford project, if you like, it was never completed in that it didn't do all the manuscripts in the body. Nevertheless, it's quite impressive for its time, and it was our inspiration, as I say. What we wanted to do was to begin the deep digitization, by which I mean from cover to cover, everything in it, warts and all, if you like. This is not... I distinguish between that type of digitization and, the greatest hits or the highlights, where you get where people will do a very colourful page with a very colourful initial and ignore the rest of the manuscript. We wanted to make the manuscripts available for scholarly use in the first instance, not really as coloured items or very attractive items. So we wanted to digitize the books from the manuscripts from cover to cover and make them freely available. That was very important, that they would be available for that one would not have to pay for this service. It was a great sense of liberating the manuscripts from their library confines, and therefore, in the very initial stage, a very interesting study. In fact, thinking back over the 20 years or so, in the initial stage of digitization was only in its infancy. It really was. We all have our phones now and our iPads and whatever, so it doesn't seem such a big deal. But back then, it was a big deal. And so part of the work in the initial stages was involved in convincing librarians and archivists that this was a good idea. It's like maybe the discovery of fire or something like that.
It does seem, you remember back to those days where you're thinking, oh yeah, we do have to convince people this is important, and it's, we're so used to it now that going back to those debates, it's kind of it's a flashback.
It is, yeah. Well, it's like explaining to children that there was a time when there was no television. So
exactly.
So that was part of the work, but we were very fortunate in that we were able to begin our work in the library of Trinity College in Dublin, and do a major manuscript there, major Gaelic manuscript there, the Book of Leinster, which was written from, say, 1160 to 1200. And that, if you like, established the various protocols in the first place that we used for digitization, the basic philosophy. It allowed us to define what high resolution actually was, and the way we would lay this out on the website. And it also then, of course, gave us a validation, if you like, that was very useful in lowering the barriers, if you like, that might have existed in other institutions also. We went on to form a very productive relationship with the Library of the Royal Irish Academy, again in Dublin, which is the major repository for Gaelic manuscripts from the early Christian period right down to the 19th century. I suppose the only, if you like, if you're looking at the Irish Script on Screen site today, it's still the same site as it was planned in the late 90s. And so it doesn't have any, if you like, of the bells and whistles that might be associated with more modern websites. And yet it is functional, and it still serves its purpose. It could do with an overhaul, certainly. I suppose one of the basic points at all times was that if we have an opportunity to digitize, we'll digitize, and we'll let commentaries and all the other aspects follow on thereafter. And once you have the basic archive of basic digital archive of all the material that you're working on, you might even talk in terms of future generation going at it, reformulating that into perhaps a more contemporary package. But from the point of view of functionality and access that was afforded scholars that they would normally have to travel to see and get permission to see, and then they could magnify it or cut and paste or do whatever you like with an image. That was a great success, and I'd like to think that it still is.
It is, like you say, it's clean, but it's functional, and it doesn't have all the frills, which actually makes it more accessible in a lot of ways. So how many fragments and books do you have on this right now?
I think we're up to 400 at the moment. That's entire manuscripts now, which is a lot considering that there's only one workstation involved in that. And that is, there's only one camera and one operator, one book cradle, and so forth. So it's a lot, and the image capture and processing is all the work of one person. It has, if you like, maybe one of the downsides is it hasn't been greatly resourced. With public funding. Nevertheless, the Institute for Advanced Studies has always backed the project and has, if you like, ring-fenced that single position, which is crucial. You know, so many projects come and go. So many projects are have short-term funding, 3, 5, 6 years. If you're interested in the future of scholarship, that kind of funding is no good. It seems. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, this is definitely a long-term project, and you need people who are far-seeing to fund it.
Yeah, and you have to take a far-seeing and point of view and understand that maybe you never get the recognition you know, for doing it, but that's not why we do it. You know, we don't do it for the Avicenna is an exception. You understand?
Yes.
So what we do for. Well, we do primarily for the love of it, you know, for a result of our own interest in it, and that's and in the consciousness that we're laying down a foundation for future workers, for future researchers, that they will be able to build their work on it, and you know, hopefully, maybe take, in the case of the ISAS, Irish Script and Screen site, take it and you know, reformat it and reorganize it in due course. But you don't do this for you know, for the bright lights and the red carpet. You do it because you actually believe in scholarship as something that is important to humanity.
Well, yeah, and as you're talking, it reminds me of this kind of being the mission of the medieval scribes as well, where they don't necessarily sign their work, but they do it for posterity.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison, you know, because you only find scribal signatures in the Gaelic tradition, or at least in the late Gaelic tradition, in medieval tradition, if they have a space at the end of a page to fill out. You know, that's where they don't consciously leave space for a colophon. Yeah. But if there's a space of 2 lines left within the text grid, okay, you know, they may sign their name. they may reveal who they, but that wasn't important to them. You know, that's a very interesting comparison.
Yeah, it's the big picture that we're looking at.
Yeah, it is true. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you about this.
No, you're very welcome, and thank you for your interest. Great work.
To find out more about Padraig's work, you can check out his University College Cork research profile at research.ucc.ie/profiles/POMACHAIN. There you'll find a handy link to the Irish Script on Screen project, or you can go straight there at www.isos.dias.ie. Click on the What's New link and scroll down to see the Avicenna fragment for yourself, as well as the 400 other complete Irish manuscripts Padraig mentioned. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalists.net to tell us what's on the website. What's new, Peter?
Hi, Danielle. Well, I've got two pieces I want to mention briefly. One is by Sherry Boots, who's continuing her series on Augustine in the Middle Ages. But this week's piece really focuses on Peter Lombard, who was one of the great thinkers in medieval theology. So you can read about that. And we also have Minji Su telling us about the Book of the Knight of the Tower, which is a 14th century manners book written by an actual knight to his three daughters. There's a lot of fun anecdotes. And so Minji's introduction to this book is really fun read. So those would be what I would recommend off medievalist.net for this week.
I love medieval books of manners. They're awesome. Thanks, Peter.
You're welcome.
People always say that you should follow your bliss, and I have to say, bringing news and conversations like this to you every week is bliss for me. So thanks for making it possible by subscribing wherever you're listening, and by spreading the word. All of your retweets and shares are so appreciated. If you have comments or suggestions, you can reach me at Danièle@medievalists.net. That's DANIELE @medievalists.net. It looks like we'll have our Patreon page up soon, so we can get started on making the podcast even better. As always, for news and great articles every single day, you can follow medievalists.net on Facebook or Twitter @medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cebulski, on social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. For a quick 5-minute fix on medieval history, you can check out my books on Amazon. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thank you so much for listening. Have an amazing day.